This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. So today in the show, I have Michael Mauboussin, and Michael has been an investment strategist, financial services industry for 25 plus years. He's taught at Columbia Graduate School of Business since 1993, and he's on the board of trustees at the Santa Fe Institute. One of his prior books, which I loved, was called More Than You Know, and the newest book that I'm looking at is called The Success Equation, Untangling Skill and Luck in Business, Sports, and Investing. Michael, thank you for joining me today.
It's great to be with you, Michael.
So let me add, we met for the first time, I believe, in the fall of 2004. Your work played a really instrumental role in some of the things that I did in my first book, Trend Following, in 2004. And I have to relate a story, and then I'll let you run with this because you have an interesting story about how your career got started and the luck component of it. I think the audience will really enjoy that. But the way that I met you, I was in an event at Legg Mason for a lunch, and with a bunch of guys, and the lunch was over, and they said, "Hey, well, let's take you over here." And I'm like just walking out the door. I don't know where I'm going. And they take me to this door, and they open the door, and I see you. We had not even met, and it was a room. It was like a classroom, like, I don't know, 75 or 100 people. And you were sitting there. You motioned for me to sit down, and I recognized the speaker speaking at the moment. It was Bill Miller. And so I sat down, and a few seconds later, Bill looked at me and goes, "Well, we'd like to welcome our special guest speaker today, Michael Covel." And I was literally just sitting there at lunch 2 seconds earlier, did not know I was going to be speaking. But that was actually my first public speaking in the investment industry, was actually at that little event with you and Bill. And both of you sat on either side of the room and peppered me with questions for about 45 minutes. And it was a really interesting, it was lucky for that to happen at that moment. But the confidence and some of the skill that I started to develop out of that very moment came right from the luck.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's a great story, and it was such a pleasure to meet you at that time. It's interesting that Bill and I both, kind of as we practice investing, it's quite different than what you've talked about and worked on and sort of more your areas of expertise. But we always very much appreciated the work you did and a lot of the ideas and insights you brought forth. So we really wanted to incorporate that into our thinking and the things that we do. So even though we're in slightly different worlds on some levels, it was really a lot of fun that day, and I recall it very fondly.
Well, the foundation, though, it's like even though the strategies might be ultimately different, the foundation and a lot of your work, how you look at statistics and the role of luck, and many of the things in this book, it doesn't make a difference what your strategy is. These foundational elements in your works, they cross borders. This is foundational.
Totally agree with that. Totally agree with that. Yep.
Why don't you relay the story about how your career got started? I don't want to give away too much, but I think it was a great story for people to understand luck.
Yeah, exactly. So, I'm a senior in college, like most college seniors. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but I knew I needed a job. So a number of firms interviewed on campus, one of them being Drexel Burnham Lambert. At the time was a very prominent and doing well investment bank. And I did well enough on the on-campus interview. They invited me to New York for sort of the final round. So, go up to New York, put on my best suit and shine my shoes. And we go there and gather in the morning. And the person that runs the program says, "Okay, here's the deal. You're going to have 6 interviews with different people, and then you're going to have 10 minutes with the head guy. So whatever you do, just, make sure you do all day, but that 10 minutes, that's really crucial." So I go through my 6 interviews, and, they go as well as expected. And then I finally get my 10 minutes with the big guy, so you kind of go down this hallway with plush carpeting, and there's this beautiful panoramic view of downtown Manhattan, and he greets me very, very warmly. And then I notice peeking out from underneath his desk a Washington Redskins trash can. Now, I had just gone to school in Washington, D.C. I'd been to a bunch of the games. I'm a sports fan. So I complimented him on his trash can. And it just hit him in an emotional spot, and he just went on about, the virtues of athletics and his great time in Washington, D.C. And I sat there pretty much nodding, yes, sir, yes, sir. And our 10 minutes stretched to 15 minutes. And a couple, so then I go back, and a couple weeks later I get the job offer, and I take the job, so it's all good. About 6 months into my program, one of the administrators kind of puts his arm around my shoulder and says, "Hey, I just want to tell you you're doing fine, but now I want to reveal something." It turns out when we were voting on the candidates, the 6 people you interviewed with, on balance, voted against bringing you in. But the head guy came down and insisted that we hire this guy. And he goes, "So I don't know what you said to him, but it really worked." And so, as I like to joke, my career was launched by a trash can. It was just a lucky comment about something that was there. And truly, in many ways, it was very, very important in terms of setting my career trajectory, and in a very important way, I truly believe I would not be where I am today had I not seen that trash can that day.
But could there have been somebody else in the same situation that saw the trash can that did not have the maybe intuitive skill to make the comment and go forward and take the random lucky trash can and take it a step further? I mean,
Definitely. And that gets into a little this issue of this topic you pointed out in this new book that's such an interesting one, right, which is Untangling Skill and Luck. And part of the challenge is setting definitions from the get-go, right? So I'm saying that it's lucky, but one way to think about this, maybe in even a more simple way, is kind of what's in your control and what's not in your control, right? So skill, if there are things that you can do to improve your lot, improve your prospects, you probably can generally call those skills. And that might be, as you pointed out, sort of the interpersonal intuition that could be helpful or whatever it is. And luck would almost be things more by definition that are somewhat out of your control. So if there are things you can control, that's more going to be in the skill bucket. Things that are really out of your control, more in the luck bucket.
When you're defining skill in the book, and I asked a fund manager friend of mine this morning, and I told him I was going to be speaking with you, and I asked him if he would define skill, and he started to give me some elaborate definition. Wasn't your simple definition very simply, can you lose on purpose?
Exactly. Isn't that great? So, I mean, the technical definition from the dictionary, which I actually think is a pretty good working definition, is the ability to use one's knowledge readily in performance or execution. So basically, you've got some sort of ability, and you can turn it on when you need to, right? So you're a violinist, and you can play the concert. You're an athlete, and you can perform at a high level in the game, whatever it is. And that makes some sense. So, but there's that really interesting test. And by the way, I should say I learned this from the poker players, right? There's a lot of debate about whether poker should be allowed to be legal online or not. And at the crux of that debate, whether it's right or wrong, but the crux of the debate is whether the poker is a game of skill or luck. And so the poker folks came up with this really simple, beautiful, elegant test, which is, can you lose on purpose? And if you can lose on purpose, then there has to be some skill in the game. And you notice like board games or even blackjack, you can lose on purpose, but there can be cases where you misplay your cards or play them quite foolishly and actually win, right? So that's a really, really simple test that I think actually carries a lot of freight, notwithstanding that it's really easy. And I guess I'll say about investing is particularly interesting. Obviously, money managers obviously try to build portfolios that do better than some sort of a benchmark after adjusting for risk and other things. And that's obviously a difficult thing to do over time. The other interesting facet is how hard it is to actually underperform by a lot. I guess you can do it through incurring costs and stuff like that. But if you just build two simple portfolios of, say, 100 stocks, it's actually hard to build a portfolio that's really, really bad. It just as it's hard to build a portfolio that's really, really good. For people that are not familiar with your work, you do an exceptional job. You use a lot of sports analogies and bringing in the sports world, because I think there's so many numbers involved with sports. And you do a great job of tying these in and getting people to understand the lessons. And we're going to talk about some of them today. But I wanted you to lay out maybe the big picture reason why, and I highly recommend this. I don't care what you know about investing. This book is just something you just have to read, and it just makes you think. I mean, if something can make you think, you have to read it. So at least that's my rule. Why did you put this particular work together, Michael? How did it start? What was going on in your... It's a great question. It just lied at the intersection of a lot of things that I was interested in, a lot of things that were popping up in life, So let me just give you sort of three big areas. One is I grew up always around athletics. I've been a very avid athlete myself and a big fan of watching sports. And it's a really interesting question. And I guess probably for me, the catalyzing moment, it seems a little bit old and tired now, but the catalyzing moment probably was reading Moneyball by Michael Lewis. Came out in 2003, and sort of creating this stark distinction between a lot of people who are using or relying almost solely on their intuitions and guts and their experience, and those that were using statistics. And, neither world in its purity is the right answer. answer. There's going to be some combination. But that got me really thinking a lot about how much of our perceptions are really guiding us properly. The world of business is another really interesting one, right? So, you have companies that do well and do poorly. How much of that is because of the brilliance or foolishness of management? How much of it is because of factors that are outside their control? How much is luck? And then, of course, in the world of investing, Burt Malkiel wrote this best-selling book called A Random Walk Down Wall Street. I mean, in the title itself, he's suggesting that luck is basically the dominant feature. But you have counterexamples of investors, many of them who you've documented in your world of trend following, that have done really, really well over long periods of time. What's going on there? Are they lucky vestiges of a statistical process, or is there something above and beyond that? So sort of bring these three areas together. And the last thing I'll say about skill and luck, which is so interesting, at every cocktail party I talk to, when I bring the topic up, everybody's interested in it. Yet very few people are kind of equipped with the right analytical or philosophical tools to address it really effectively. So that to me was really a fertile thing, because it was sort of the intersection of a bunch of different areas. It's a topic everybody's really deeply interested in, and yet most people are not particularly well equipped. And you said the best thing that you could say about my book, which is it gets you to think, right? To start to get now some tools and ways of thinking about this problem that can help you ultimately make better decisions in the future.
What do you talk about maybe at a foundational level, before we get into some more examples, the human desire, the emotional need to tell stories after the fact, and that perhaps that's kind of foundational to people having a trouble separating or untangling skill and luck?
So Michael, this issue I think is so fundamental, and it's so absolutely fascinating. There's been work done in neuroscience. The main guy on this is Michael Gazzaniga, that have identified part of your left hemisphere. This is for all of us, that they've dubbed the interpreter, and this is a part of your brain that seeks causes for the effects it observes. And what Gazzaniga's work did that was so, I think, fascinating and sort of path-breaking, his primary work was on split brain patients. So, of course, your brain has two hemispheres, and there's a cable of nerves between them called the corpus callosum. These people had, in many cases, really bad epilepsy, so they would sever the corpus callosum. So now your brain has two different parts, and the parts can't talk to one another, right? Because we basically cut the line of communication. And what the researchers then could do would feed information to the right hemisphere, right? And your language is primarily in the left hemisphere. They'd feed information to the right hemisphere. Your left hemisphere doesn't know what's going on, and yet your brain, the interpreter, would kick in and start to literally make up stories to close the cause and effect loops. It was absolutely fascinating. And their point is, this little interpreter is working in all of us all the time. So the point being, if I say to you, hey, the future has some skill and some luck and some combination, everybody goes, yeah, totally get that. But once something happens, part of your, and I mean this in a really kind of physical sense, part of your brain is designated to create, as you pointed out, create a narrative that closes the cause and effect loop and then basically puts the story to rest. And the key is that your interpreter doesn't know about skill and luck. It doesn't make any of these distinctions, right? It just wants something that's plausible, in some cases not even plausible, something that sort of fills the gap and then moves on and then shuts the case. And there's a really interesting paper by Andy Lowe at MIT, professor, where he looked at 20-plus accounts of the financial crisis, roughly half written by journalists, half by academics. And what he found was there was really there are a couple things, but really no common themes. In fact, some of the themes were in conflict with one another, right? So what happens is all these people are creating narratives, their own narratives, often to make themselves look good, incidentally, that explain what happened. So this is something just to be very, very mindful of. Is this part of your brain is this cause and effect loop closer that often will use the facts to do it, but it's not beyond making up something that's a story, a narrative that's bogus in order to scratch this itch of cause and effect.
I should lay out a foundation too, for our conversation today. The work that Michael is putting into this book, what he's doing. To me, as I'm going through and I'm reading the book, it's very difficult to kind of digest this whole what you've done in a linear fashion. I almost look at, if I could imagine your book in spherical form, it's almost a sphere where you kind of almost have to three-dimensionally look at all this content because it's so interrelated and coming at different directions and different levels that you really can't grasp in a linear fashion what you've put in this book. Does that make sense where I'm trying to go with that?
Yeah, well, I'll take that as a compliment, but I think that what I try to do, because you're right, I mean, there's so many things and you're going off in different directions, but I will say that the structure of the book, I try to do three things. The first part of the book, and we've talked a little bit about this, is kind of the early quick lessons of this, but also, for example, the really neat thing you said, like there's skill if you can lose on purpose, but also a little bit of why it's so hard. So the discussion of the interpreter and this idea of our love of narratives. That's one of the really important reasons up front to recognize that we're not very good at this. The middle part of the book is part of a roll-up-your-sleeves kind of thing, which is, hey, if you really want to think about this seriously and quantify the effects of skill and luck, here are some tools and techniques to do this. And you mentioned sports. One of the, and I think correctly stated, one of the virtues of sports is it's basically a pretty stable system. We've got a lot of numbers and a lot of data over time. What was attractive to me about that is it creates some tools and methods to think about these kinds of problems that are not always perfect when you take them to the world of investing or to the world of business, but they're pretty good. And they give you some ways to think about problems that I think are very effective. The third part of the book is about what do you do about all this? If you accept the essential roles of skill and luck in these different activities, now what? And so there's a chapter dedicated to thinking about how to improve your skill, how to manage luck, and then I had a dedicated chapter to specifically the idea of reversion to the mean, because it's an idea that's so prominent in so many areas, and everybody nods yes when you mention it as if they understand it, yet time after time and field after field, people don't behave as if they understand it. So one is the setup, second is roll up your sleeves and get analytically how to do it, the third part is what to do about it.
I'm going to jump into a couple of your great sports examples, and I guess when I was saying the spherical thinking, it's just because there's so many different ways you can come at this, and I think people will see that when I start to bring up some of these examples. Why don't I let you run? And it's a classic story, and you kind of really break it down. Why it was so important to you to discuss, frankly, Stephen Jay Gould's notion about the 400 hitter in baseball. And as a baseball fan, as somebody who, I guess when I was a senior in high school, I was about 5 feet away from getting one out in dead straight center field at Georgetown. So they caught it on the warning track and hit the fence. So I was not happy about that. But anyways, maybe you could run and kind of explain that from your perspective and why it's in your book.
Yeah, Michael, great question. And I think that if there's one sort of idea that is people pick up on in this book, it's this idea, and I call it the paradox of skill. And you set it up really nicely with the Stephen Jay Gould. By the way, let me just state what the paradox of skill is up front. It says that in many fields, as skill improves, luck becomes more important in the results. Right, so that's the sort of the counterintuition, is that more skill equals more luck in terms of the outcomes. So the last guy that hit over 400 in Major League Baseball was Ted Williams. He hit 406 in 1941. And so it's an interesting question why no player's been able to do that since. Now, about 20 years ago, Stephen Jay Gould, who was a very famous biologist at Harvard, took up this issue and sort of pondered, why is this the case? And, the first couple things he talked about, hey, maybe it's because the players travel more, they play more night games, or, they're relief pitchers now. And he basically dismissed all those possible explanations. And then he said, maybe Ted Williams is just like a freakish hitter. Maybe the guy was just the greatest guy ever and every guy since. And then he said, well, if you look at other sports, almost without exception, everyone's gotten better. And he says the way you can really measure that is sports that compete against the clock. So, runners or swimmers. And we know they're just much better today, much faster today than they were 70 years ago. So as he's examining this, he sort of says, here's the explanation that actually makes the most sense. And you can think about some of these batting averages as sort of a draw from a skill distribution, right? So you even think about a bell-shaped distribution. So there are the really great hitters, a bunch of average hitters, and then the not-so-good hitters, and then some draw from a luck distribution. And what Gould argued is that as people get better in a field, what happens is the skill distribution narrows. It becomes a fat bell-shaped curve to a skinny bell-shaped curve. So if you want to be more formal, and many of your listeners will understand this language, the variance or standard deviation goes down over time. And so what happens is, even if the distribution of luck doesn't change at all, that means the standard deviation of all batting averages will go down, right? Because the luck component being the same, skill going down, that means everything goes down. And that is precisely what Gould found. So it turns out the standard deviation of batting averages in Major League Baseball today is quite a bit less than it was when Ted Williams achieved his feat in 1941. And just to give you some sort of calibration, he was a 4 standard deviation event in 1941. So that's just awesome, right? But if you were a 4 standard deviation hitter in 2011, for example, 70 years later, you would have hit 380, right? That's awesome, obviously, but that's a lot less than 406. So in a sense, the improvement means that the difference between the best players and the average players in terms of skill is narrower than it used to be. That's the key. And so luck becomes more important in dictating outcomes.
You know, you make a follow-up point in the book about this, where you bring up the notion of the physical limit, and that we can only go so far. And I kind of chuckled to myself that you used an example from a guy named John Brinkus, who hosts Sports Science on ESPN. John is somebody who I actually grew up playing baseball with.
Really?
Yeah. So, but I mean, maybe you could actually go with that, and maybe even talk about the physical aspect of reaching that physical limit, and maybe even go into the example that you mentioned here with John.
Yeah, so I really actually, John Brinkus wrote a book called The Perfection Point, which was a scientific step through of various activities and the limit of human performance. So how fast can a human swim a certain distance? How fast can a human run a marathon or mile? Or how much can they bench press and so forth? And so the point he makes is that there are obviously physiological limits for these things. And as humans, we've been slowly and steadily moving toward those physical limits. So there's a point where no one can run a marathon faster than a certain time. So John's obviously trying to quantify that. So taking that back into this notion of skill, there are two things. And so let's just now leave aside for a moment things that have luck in it. So let's just look at pure skill activities. These are runners and racers and those kinds of things, swimmers, where you're competing solely effectively with the clock, right? So you see two effects that are really prominent. Number one is you're moving inexorably toward that right wall of performance. So people are inching toward the limit of human performance. And I can't remember the exact number, but I think in like marathons, you're 5 or 6 minutes away from what he deems to be the ultimate possibility. The second thing you see is clustering of performance, which is the guy that comes in first, second, third, their results are a lot closer. And what we show in the book, for instance, is men's marathon times from 1932 to 2012. And it turns out men are running the marathon are about 23 and a half minutes faster. So, and if you're a runner, it's almost a minute a mile pace for that distance. That's actually 26 miles. That's pretty impressive. But the second thing, as the paradox of skill would predict, is the difference between the guy who came in first and won the gold medal and the guy who came in 20th was 39 minutes in 1932, and it's now down to about 7 minutes. So you're getting absolute improvement and relative clustering in results. And those are things that are natural offshoots of the paradox of skill. And by the way, clearly we can document this in sports, especially things against the clock, but there's good evidence they're happening in other realms as well. So for example, in business, there's been a lot of research on the uniformity of quality. So breakfast cereals or something, the quality of those products are much more uniform today than they were a generation or two ago. So this is an interesting thing, is that as people improve and uniformity of skill improves in our world, luck becomes more prominent. Sort of this interesting, almost backwards idea, but it's pretty cool.
Let me let you run in a slightly different direction. This is all interrelated. So you use an example in the book, and I believe it's maybe a contest of Playboy Playmates making stock picks. And so I think one gal does really well or something like that. And but what usually doesn't happen in these types of contests, especially when they start to say, well, gosh, why should I give my money to XYZ professional fund manager if Gloria over here with Hugh Hefner is done exceptionally well? Why do I need to be involved with perhaps Mr. Mauboussin or anybody else? So, but you correctly bring up something that people discount in almost every walk of life, which is the idea of sample size.
Right. So let me take one big step back and just mention one thing. So one of the ways to think about this whole problem is a continuum, right? From all luck, no skill. So on that end, it would be lotteries and roulette wheels and that kind of thing. To the other end, which would be all skill, no luck, and that would be a running race or a chess match or something like that. Okay, and then everything interesting in life is sort of between those two extremes. So where you are on that continuum tells you a lot about how important the sample size is. So, for example, when you have extreme skill activities, you can actually operate with relatively small sample sizes, right? So, in other words, you and I play tennis. You're a better tennis player than me. We play a five set match. You're going to win, and you're going to win this weekend and next weekend and every time we play, right? That's because skills dictating the results. We don't need a lot of sample size to know that you're the better tennis player.
The Federer consistency.
Yeah. Now when you get to guys like Federer, those guys are also good. They're really almost evenly matched, but you get the point. So if you're 10 or 15% different, there's a massive outcome difference. Now, if you go over to the luck side of the continuum, that's where if there is some differential skill, and by the way, I want to be really clear, in investing, as you know, I believe there is differential skill. But there is also a lot of randomness, especially in the short term. That's where small sample size will absolutely kill you, because you simply can't separate the luck from the skill in really short periods of time. And that leads to the story that you alluded to, and I think this trading company did it, sort of I'm sure it was a publicity sort of half-hearted, where they went to these Playmates of the month and asked them to make their stock picks. And when you aggregate, there are only 10 of them, I think, but you aggregate the results, they did better than, in percentage of them, they did better, and percentage returns did better than many professionals, but for a year. And sort of the point I make is, can you imagine any other field where people walking in off the street can do better than, can you imagine that those playmates could outperform your dentist or your auto mechanic or somebody that's doing it? Just seems almost, or your accountant, right? So it just tries to really underscore that point, as you already alluded to, that when you're on the luck side of the continuum, sample size, you need to have a sufficient sample size to draw any sort of real conclusions about anything. If you're on the skill side, small sample size are going to serve you fine, because there's no distortion in the signal.
Yeah, I'm going to slightly shift gears again. Like I said, this is all related, and I could talk to you all day. I know we can't keep you all day, but the idea of individual skill versus the situation, and you talk about once again, you talk about athletes, you talk about high performing executives at firms, and that sometimes perhaps you could be a running back on the Washington Redskins back in the day named Timmy Smith, and you could be Super Bowl guy getting 200 yards. But was it really Timmy Smith, or was it the offensive line that's all gone to the Hall of Fame? And so maybe you could address the idea of individual skill versus situations.
Absolutely. And Michael, I think this harkens back a little bit to our discussion about the interpreter, right? So how we observe outcomes, we want to create stories to explain what's going on. And this happens a lot in the sports world, also happens a lot in the business world. And let's give examples from both. So from the sports world, as you pointed out, there was a really interesting study of football players, in particular, two different positions. One were wide receivers and the other were punters. Now, wide receivers obviously depend on a lot of interaction, right? They have an effective quarterback. As you point out, they need to have an offensive line that protects the quarterback and so forth. Punters, by contrast, are doing their own thing. Pretty much no matter where they are, it's the same thing. They need a guy who can get them the ball with a snap, but after that, they're doing the same thing no matter where they are. So it turns out when you trade a wide receiver from one team to the next, his effectiveness goes down. So he becomes part of a new system. He's not as good. So that underscores the fact that the system that you're in, the circumstances you're in, are actually very important in dictating your performance, at least for some period of time. Whereas they found, by contrast, the punters made no difference. You could trade a punter from one place to the next, and the guy performs basically the same no matter where he is. So that's one example from the world of sports. From the world of business, there was a really interesting study by the same guys, actually, that looked at GE managers. And also GE is known for some of the finest training of executives in any corporation in the world. And so these guys said, all right, well, let's take a look at 20 executives that left GE over about a 20-year period and how they did in other organizations. And it turns out almost exactly half of them went to firms that were very similar structurally to GE, and the other half went to firms that were very different. So, for example, one guy went from running, a business at GE to running a supermarket, something very different. And what they found was the guys that were doing stuff very similar to GE actually did very well. They did well for their shareholders and their profits and so forth. Those guys that went to different businesses, different industries, actually did very, very poorly. So it's not the GE training per se that makes an executive effective. It was really the combination of that training and the environment that made him effective. And that's a really important, useful lesson for people. It's not always the individual, how he or she looks, how they sound, and even where the training is. It's really how they fit into the situation, and can they be effective in that situation.
Let me let you get concrete a little bit, because I know there is a statistical foundation once you get past trying to get people to bring them into the door to see this untangling that has to take place. But ultimately, there are some ways you can use statistics to kind of look at persistence and a predictive value. And ultimately, I think I'd love to let you run with that a little bit, and then ultimately maybe we can move into talking about how people can think about building skill.
Exactly. So this is this is one of my favorite chapters. It's chapter 7, and it's entitled "What Makes for a Useful Statistic." Right. So as you know, we wade into the world, and again, watching sports or business or politics or whatever, there are just tons of statistics bandied about. And the question is, we know intuitively that they're not all created equally. Is there a simple test that we can apply to them to try to figure out which ones are more useful than others? And the answer is, I think, and I learned this from the sports guys, there are basically two things that you're after, right? The first is called persistence. And that basically means that what happens in this period is very correlated with what happened in the last period. So, for example, I might say, if I want to know, Michael, your batting average for 2012, I might look at the batting average for 2011. I can see how correlated they are. So is it if I knew it in 2011, is it predicted well in 2012? Or I could look at another statistic, for example, what the Moneyball guys did, on base percentage. And it turns out, if you study those correlations, on-base percentage is consistently much higher, has a much higher correlation. So it's much more persistent, which typically indicates it's much more reflective of your skill. So there's one concrete example. On-base percentage is better than batting average. Okay, so that's one, persistence, right? That it's consistent over time. The second one is called predictive. And here that basically means is, hey, does my statistic, if I do well or poorly, correlate with the objective I'm trying to achieve? So, for example, let's stay with baseball. Let's say I'm trying to offensively generate runs, right? So how do I generate runs? So now I can say, okay, how does batting average correlate with run production? And then how does on-base percentage correlate with run production? And it turns out on-base percentage correlates higher than on batting average. So now, when I'm comparing those two statistics, I see that on-base percentage is both more persistent and more predictive, and hence is going to be a more useful statistic because it's a truer indicator of the skill, and it's also truer to serving the objective I'm trying to achieve. So you could take that basic template, and then you can apply that to business, you can apply it to investing, you can apply it to wherever you want in order to get a sense of what is more or less useful. And by the way, this is it seems when you say it makes complete sense, but it's striking how few people really do think about the quality of their statistics. And by the way, in the business world, I can tell you that if you survey executives and ask them about the virtue of the financial and non-financial measures they use, most of them, majority of them say that actually they're not that good. Even though they've picked them, they're not that good. So I think it's a really, really interesting area. It's an area where we can get better than we are now, and that persistence, predictive template, I think, can be really helpful in guiding that thinking.
So let me let you run with a couple more here. So if I'm looking near the end of your book, you start to talk about building skill and getting people to understand some of the tools or the thought processes behind this. And I'm gonna give a couple here. You can run with the ones that they're all in the book and they're all very important. But one of the ones that I love, and I actually I was always very kind to source it, but I stole that process versus outcome chart from you years ago, which I thought was great. So you talk about process versus outcome, deliberate practice, coaching, checklist, understanding your biases. All of these are extremely important for building skill.
Yeah, and so let's go back to our little continuum, right? All luck, no skill side, and all skill, no luck side. And so I'll just talk about these very quickly. On the all skill side, right, no luck, that's where this stuff on deliberate practice really makes sense, right? And deliberate practice is a very specific term which says you need to practice right at the cusp of your ability in a very structured way. So every day is a challenge. It's hard work. It's hours a day. And of course, there's this famous, idea of 10,000 hours, which is not really true. It's on average is probably true. It can be less or it can be more. But this idea of really applying yourself and being extremely dedicated. By the way, I can't resist remarking that there have been a slew of books on this topic of sort of deliberate practice. And there's, I think, an undertone that if you just practice a lot, you're going to be successful at something. And I think what that leaves out is that there really is, in many cases, a genetic component. Some of us really are better at seeing than others. That means we can hit a baseball more effectively. Some of us really are better at music and language than others. And there's some innate kind of kickstart to that. So no one gets to be the top of their field without a ton of practice. But also, having some sort of innate ability often really helps you. Now let's go to the other side, right? The mostly luck, little skill part. And that, exactly to your point, is where it's about process, not focusing on outcomes. And so to me, process, for example, in investing, I typically talk about three components. These are many things you've talked about and written about over the years as well. One is an analytical component, so ability to generate the numbers. Second is a behavioral component. So in other words, understanding biases and being able to manage or mitigate those. And the third is an organizational bias. So or constraint. So making sure that you're in an organization that's focused on the right things, and that the organization itself doesn't impose constraints that affect your outcomes. And then the last thing I will mention, checklists. I mean, it's a really fascinating area. Obviously the best and most popular work on that is by Atul Gawande, who wrote a book called The Checklist Manifesto. And I'll just mention one little angle on that. He talks about two kinds of checklists, which I find that's very useful. One is he calls do confirm, which basically says do your job and then pause every now and then to confirm that you did what you were supposed to do. So you're a pilot in the cockpit, you kind of know what you're supposed to do, and then every now and then you stop and say, I want to make sure I did all the things I was supposed to. The second kind of checklist is even more interesting. It's called read do. And this is a situation when you're in some sort of emergency, and this is when you can lose your cool, right? The read do then says, read this and then do what it says. So, for example, left wing engine, goes out or something. You're a pilot. Of course, your initial reaction is going to be to freak out a little bit. The redo checklist then guides your thinking and your decision making so that you can keep cool and keep calm in the face of that type of a stress. So that's another thing I can really I think can help people to make sure that they're really faithful to what they should be doing in terms of execution, and then also providing a guide, especially in emergency or stressful situations.
There's two other things I want to kind of bring up before we wrap up, but you bring up Mike Leach, the former coach at Texas Tech. And for those familiar with Leach, he left Texas Tech, but he was extremely innovative, and he often did not have the best players. He did not have a whole slew of NFL guys, and he was able to win in this very tough conference. And I think what's really interesting is that that's a certain type of skill. But then if you look at, Saban in Alabama, he lines up these guys every year that are all first-round picks. That's a type of skill too. So it's kind of this interesting conundrum where you've got one man who's using maybe kind of, it's almost like the David and the Goliath type thing, but they're both using skill. It's just coming at it from different ways.
Yeah, right on. It's really interesting. So the basic argument I make in that about that type of stuff is, and I think you even using David and Goliath, let's continue with that. So So Alabama would be sort of the Goliath, right? They really can attract great players through Saban and so forth. And when you are the stronger player, what you want to do is simplify the game, bring the game onto your terms, and just beat people straight up, right? So you want to kind of keep the boundaries narrow and just make sure your skill overwhelms the other player. When you're the underdog, when you're David, you don't want to go, David didn't beat Goliath by going toe-to-toe. He would have gotten mauled, right? He chose an alternative strategy. And I think that's an articulation, a little bit of what Mike Leach was. He wasn't able to draw the first, the top high school picks. So he had to be more innovative in his structure. And so that leads to the second lesson, which is if you're the underdog or the weaker player, complicate the game, add dimensions to it, make it, add trick plays, add different formations. And what Leach says over and over is, our goal is to put their players in situations that they're not comfortable with or familiar with, right? So by adding the complication. Now, the stronger player might still have the advantage, but it dilutes their strength substantially. And, you mentioned football, but it turns out the same mindset applies in other realms as well. It's clearly a big issue, huge theme in warfare, right? So for many centuries, armies used to go toe-to-toe, but over the centuries, guerrilla tactics have evolved and so forth to try to fight in a non-traditional way. You also see it in the world of business. If you want to, you're going to try to compete with, Tide and the laundry detergent, you're going to get killed. You have to choose sort of alternative strategies, disruptive innovations to try to get a foothold into the market. So that's the basic idea there is, if you're the favorite, simplify. If you're the underdog, complicate. That's the best chance to win in both those instances.
Yeah, I have one last question here, and I'll let you wrap up with with any issues that you might feel are really important for the audience to kind of take away. But I think you use the term, you talk about the improving your guesswork on where you are in the luck skill continuum. And I think it's interesting how you use the word guesswork, because so many people in this day and age, they don't like the word guess. They want perfection, or they want to imagine that perfection is possible. So here you are saying how to improve your guesswork on where you might be in the luck skill continuum. And I think ultimately that's probably where you want people to be thinking by the time they get to the end of your work.
Exactly. So you say, why go through all this? And the answer is, at the end of the day, is you want to be able to make better predictions. You want to understand the world and the future more effectively than you do today. And as you point out, in some fields we can do that very well. If it's almost a pure skill or something that's very reductionist from a scientific point of view, you can really pin it down very, very effectively. But for vast swaths of our world, our society, and I would argue even a rising percentage of our society, that's just really difficult to do. So it requires you to think about these other tools and techniques in a more effective way. And and I try to be clear about some examples of the methodologies and things you could think about in that context. So, to me, figuring out where you are in that luck to skill continuum, and then understanding the repercussions given where you are. If you just get a basic handle on that, it really, really can improve your ability to make sensible decisions.
So when you're out and about, and here you are, you're researching all this cool stuff. I mean, it's got to be one of the coolest gigs here, that you get to be behind the scenes and all this stuff. A lot of the sports related stuff, you get to talk to all these interesting people. So when people come up to you, or they get a handle on what you're up to, or if they already know you, is there any one thing of all these different walks of life that you research and are behind the scenes on that people really come at you either in a positive, supportive way, like, oh, that just reinforced, or they either want to debate with you? Is there a Michael Mauboussin lightning bolt that they want to come on or attach to, or so?
No, I think that, and I think you alluded to this, I think that what intrigues people typically about this kind of work, and I think you articulated very right, I feel very blessed and very lucky, right, that I'm able to do some of this stuff, is really this transdisciplinary approach, right? So most people are, for example, I met with a guy recently who is a sports statistics guy, but he really writes about one sport. He actually doesn't even pay attention to other sports. And so this idea that being able to kind of go across different fields and glean the ideas or concepts that are most valuable from those or useful from those, and then put them together in one place, I think is the most interesting thing, and the thing that often comes up the most when people talk to me about this. And I think people love seeing those connections, and sometimes it's interesting. So sometimes, people can see even errors or mistakes or biases. I'm sure you've encountered this a lot. People can see it in other fields more readily than they can see it in themselves, right? So right. In some ways, you could see like, if that guy's doing that and that's not right, hopefully it gets you to reflect a little bit on what you're doing and whether you could be doing something more effectively. So to me, if you said what is the one thing, I think it is that sort of transdisciplinary element of this, being able to sort of go across fields and pluck the ideas that are really useful and try to put them together in some sort of cohesive fashion.
Yeah. As I just kind of give you a lead out here, my most interesting one for me is connecting as a 6-month Intuit convert to yoga. I'm the psychological connections between yoga and trading are immense in terms of how that all connects. Yep. Well, listen, Michael, today I'm speaking with Michael Mauboussin, and his newest book is The Success Equation, Untangling Skill and Luck in Business, Sports, and Investing. You can find Michael everywhere. And specifically on Amazon to buy his newest book. Michael, what's the best website where people can find you at if they want to connect or read more about what you got going on?
Yeah, right on. So the easiest one for me is www.michaelmauboussin.com. So it's just my first name, last name, all in one spot.com. This book actually has its own little dedicated website. There's some fun little simulations. So some of the things in the book are drawn out there, and that's it's the www.success-equation.com. I'll also mention there's some nerds out there that love this stuff. We have the whole bibliography from the Success Equation at success-equation.com, all annotated. So you click on any of the links, it'll take you back to the primary source. So if you're interested in following up on any of the topics or the readings, that's a great place to do that. And you can contact me through michaelmauboussin.com or the Success Equation, success-equation.com.
I've met you, though. You didn't seem like a nerd yourself.
Well, you'll have to have a little nerd in us to be interesting.
Yeah. Well, listen, Michael, I'm most appreciative today. Hopefully we can talk again in the future, and hopefully we'll get this to be another top episode here on iTunes. So I appreciate you taking the time.
Pleasure is mine, Michael. Thanks.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.